Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Local Plan Working Group. Thanks to everyone that's been in attendance. It was something of a challenge trying to find a date ahead of the executive meeting to be able to do this, so we do really appreciate everyone who's made the effort, both members and substitutes that have turned up today. So I think going through that one, I have had apologies from Councillor Taylor, and Councillor Melly is with us. Apologies from Councillor Perrott, and Councillor Crawshaw is with us. Councillor Barnes, apologies, and Councillor Galvin, apologies, with no substitutes. Okay, item 1 on the agenda is declarations of interest. Does anybody have a particular interest to declare? Councillor Fisher.
Thank you. It's not a pecuniary or particular personal interest, but the Stranshill Neighbourhood Plan is mentioned on page 50 and 52, and I've been one of the members who's been drawing that plan up.
Any further declarations of interest? No. Item 2 on the agenda, if you can cast your minds back, those of us who were there on the 15th of June at the last Local Plan Working Group, are we happy to agree those are the correct record? Okay, thank you. And that takes us to item 3, public participation. We have one member of the public registered to speak today, Mr. Jeff Beacon. If I can invite you up to the table, Mr. Beacon, you have 3 minutes to address the committee. So be a button that looks like a Wi-Fi symbol.
That's it. Right. The conclusion will be the local plan sets the scene for ruining the climate and exiling the poor. We all know that climate will get worse, ruin the lives of others and future generations, and despoiling the natural world. Unfortunately, many of our comforts and pleasures depend on greenhouse gas emissions, the cause of this catastrophe. The rich and affluent enjoy more of these comforts and pleasures, as Hargreaves and L noted in a report commissioned by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. This found that greenhouse emissions from car use were 4.5 times more than the most affluent for the most affluent than from the least affluent 10%. For aviation, the difference was over 6 times. The website carbon.place reports larger differences between affluent and poor, but this is exacerbated by geography. Car-based neighbourhoods with easy access to the ring road, like Bishopthorpe, Woodthorpe and Cotmanthorpe. The local plan plans more like these climate-destroying settlements. In York, it is almost impossible for those with modest incomes to get on the housing ladder. Here, house prices are higher than other towns in the region and much higher than Hull, Doncaster and Bradford. The average house price in Hull is about half compared to one in York. Also, renting is becoming much more expensive. York Mix reveals that York is the least affordable city in Yorkshire to rent a home, with prices going up 10.2% in a year. In York, if you owned a plot of land worth £500 at agricultural prices, its value would increase by between £100,000 and £200,000 if planning permission were granted to build a house. This is planning gain, the main source of the disproportionate profits of the developers, as the Department of Levelling Up has called this. This helps York's housing to become unaffordable for lower and middle income earners. Many of the low paid will be driven out of York. In short, the local plan sets the scene for ruining the climate and exiling the poor. This is hard to refute. I challenge any of you to do that. Please do try. One big step will be to refuse planning permission for any development that is not car-free, but that is too lengthy to go into here. But you may look up my website, russellblog.co.uk, and see a short article on that.
Thank you, Mr. Beacon. You reached your conclusion almost bang on 3 minutes. So well done in terms of that one. Obviously, those comments will be taken on board and as we go into the rest of the meeting. You're more than welcome to stay for the rest of the meeting. If you did want to leave, I believe you will need officer assistance to get back out of the building. So if you do, just indicate if you do want to go at any time before the end.
I'll sit at the
Okay, no problem, Mr. Beacon. Good. Okay, that takes us on to item 4, which is the City of York Planning Policy Housing Delivery Action Plan Update and Local Development Scheme. And I'll first hand over to Mr. Ferris.
So the report in front of you deals with the Housing Delivery Action Plan and the updated Local Development Scheme. Both are required of the authority statutorily. The Housing Delivery Action Plan required, as you will see in the text, and my colleague Laura Bartle will go through, the requirement for the Housing Delivery Action Plan is required because we are not fulfilling the government's expectations in respect of housing delivery. But there is, as will be noted, a difference between the government's expectations and your own expectations as local councillors in respect of your local plan ambition. Before I hand over to Laura, I'll just note that in terms of the Housing Delivery Action Plan, the first 3 items on page 33 of that action plan are all related or closely related to the delivery of the local plan itself. And in response to Mr. Beacon's comments, that will be brought back for consideration by the local plan working group in January, and then go on to executive at the end of January, which is also laid out in the local development scheme, which gives you the programme of delivery of the local plan. So if I hand over to Laura, she can go through the details of both schemes.
Thank you, Neil. Yes, I'll take each of the documents in turn and provide a bit of background and context to them. Looking firstly then at the Housing Delivery Action Plan, as Neil has outlined, it's a specific requirement of the NPPF, which itself sets out that local authorities have to produce an action plan where they've delivered less than 95% of their housing requirement. That housing requirement and the council's performance against it looks back over the past 3 years. It's calculated by government and reported annually in the publication of their housing delivery test results. So in response to the 2021 housing delivery test results, Executive approved the council's first housing delivery action plan last December. Officers have now updated that action plan in light of the latest housing delivery test results, which were published earlier this year, with the city performance dropping to 65% as measured against that housing requirement. So a couple of points on the housing delivery test and that housing requirement figure. In the absence of an adopted local plan, the standard methodology is used to calculate the annual requirement, which is, I'm sure you're all familiar with, is higher than what is proposed in the local plan as 822 dwellings per annum. The comparisons provided in table 1 of the report to see that comparative figure. Upon adoption of the local plan, the housing delivery test will be measured against that annual requirement. But that, of course, assumes that the housing delivery test survives any future updates of the NPPF, along with things like 5-year land supplies, which are all a little up in the air at the moment, particularly given the delayed reporting of the Levelling Up bill. So the action plan itself, the actions within it are largely unchanged. On reflection, they still appear to be relevant to current circumstances, and on that basis, the updates have been relatively narrow, focusing quite heavily on reflecting the progress that has been made in the local plan over the last year and how the council is able to use that progress to start supporting and bringing forward sites to planning application stage upon early adoption of soon after the local plan is adopted. The actions themselves are also very deliberately focused on what the council's involvement in supporting and facilitating housing delivery can actually be, recognising that many of the issues at play are very multi-layered and extend far beyond the council's control. So that's the action plan. Moving then to the local development scheme and the update that we've provided here. That is also a specific requirement, in this case, a legal requirement of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act. In very short and simple terms, it's a timetable of all of the spatial planning activity that's immediately forecast. The local development scheme that's presented to you looks more closely at work plans for the next 2 years, but critically traces the steps of the local plans adoption. And many of the items hinge very tightly to that. It also plots the anticipated community infrastructure levy timescale, which is not directly linked to the local plans adoption, but it's an important one to set out. You will also have noted that there are anticipated supplementary planning documents that are presented with an immediate focus covering climate change issues and affordable housing issues, with other topics forming recommendations that are likely to come forward in January as part of the local plan modifications approval. And then finally, just to recognise that it also identifies neighbourhood plan activity that's in train and work that's underway updating the statement of community involvement. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I'll open up to questions. Councillor Corshaw.
Thanks. Just as a point of clarity, because I appreciate there's a difference in figures between the government and the local plan. I think I've calculated, though, that even on our own local plan requirement, we're still below the 85% threshold. So actually, it doesn't really matter which figure we take, we would still be having to do this anyway, wouldn't we?
Yeah, that's correct. My calculation quickly was around 83%, I think. So yeah, you're quite right. The requirement to produce an action plan would be the same.
Councillor Pavlik.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the report, Laura. I've got a list of questions, so I'll just start and then somebody else can chip in. We had to do this last year, and we had a set of targets and objectives. How did we do measured against those, given that performance dropped quite markedly from last year to this year? From delivery, 65%. We had a higher percentage last year, didn't we?
That's correct. Yes, last year was around 85%, I think.
And this year 65%.
That's correct. And one of the reasons for that is, as I said, the way that it's calculated, it looks back over the past 3 years. Yeah. So I think 2017-18 was a particularly high year for completions. Over 1,000 dwellings per annum were completed that year. That's now dropped off the calculation because it's beyond that 3 years. So you get that significant drop in percentage terms.
Thanks. That's what I suspected. So these figures are the lowest that we've had over the past 10 years. This last 3 year cycle.
I've got Neil wanting to come in.
Sorry.
So I will just, if you finish, I'll respond.
Oh yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes. You mentioned though at about below 75%, the presumption in favour of sustainable development, MPPF will apply in decision making, and that is already in effect operating now. Can you explain what that means and what that means for the the local planning authority when applications are coming through, particularly if they're not in the local plan?
So I'll just pick up, if Laura picks up the second part of the question, Councillor Pavlich, just in respect to the first part, in terms of the performance of the authority, clearly what we're reporting on here is the market performance in respect of delivering of houses, not the authority's consenting of housing delivery. So if you look on page 40, Appendix 1, which is the housing delivery action plan details there, you'll see we've got 7,648 planning permissions extant, not delivered. And if you look at last year's, and I would agree, poor performance in terms of delivery by the housing sector, a significant proportion of that was actually delivered by the council's own housing delivery programme. So if it wasn't for the housing delivery programme, the council would be even worse. I think what is reported there in page 40 is also the reality of using a 3-year average that covers a period of COVID when a lot of the city was closed, certainly the construction industry was closed down, and we were concerned with post-Brexit supply issues, particularly around timber, then steel, that impacted on the delivery of houses in those years. But then when you look forward, and I think the reason I highlighted the first 3 points of the action plan being all about the local plan, when Laura and the team have engaged with developers about their delivery expectations, so this is them actually delivering rather than consents, the first 3 years of the local plan, you're looking at delivery of 1,500 homes plus, is their view that they fed into us. Because clearly what the local plan does is release, all being well subject to members' decisions, but if approved in accordance with the local plan, it releases those larger greenbelt sites that are currently not available to developers in the city because we're constrained to the brownfield sites. And I'll let Laura answer the second part of the question.
Sorry, can I just come back on that? Yes, I certainly acknowledge all of those points, and I do want to raise some of the issues around consent that you've got in here. But the government did make an allowance in respect of COVID, didn't they, Neil? In these calculations.
Yes, on page 8. So that's the table on page 8.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Yes, just with respect of the presumption in favour of sustainable development, that is in effect a planning principle that's embedded in the NPPF and kicks in and is triggered not just by performance against the housing delivery test, which we've noted here. There are other situations where it can arise, which, as we've said in the report, includes where there is no up-to-date local plan in place, or policies within an updated local plan are in fact out of date. When that occurs, the principle is that authorities should look favourably on planning applications. There are a number of caveats that are footnoted to the particular paragraphs in the NPPF, one of which is Greenbelt, which provides quite a tight policy restriction. So whilst the presumption could apply, it's actually disengaged in circumstances where sites are within Greenbelt. Where they're not within Greenbelt, the presumption can apply. And really what that means is that applications should be looked at favourably, making sure that all components of sustainability, in this case, social, economic and environmental aspects, are fed into the decision-making process. And what it tries to achieve is where you've got a policy vacuum in effect that is operational, it tries to make sure that decisions can still be made in those such circumstances.
Can I just ask a supplementary?
Yes, I would ask a supplementary to your first one.
Oh,
So I'll let you go.
oh,
I'll let you go with
oh,
your supplementary, and then I'll go back to the other supplementary.
So from that, on page 25, Annex A 5.2, you've got major application grant and refusal rates. Has that been a consequence of this presumption of sustained development? And we've seen applications coming forward that are inappropriate, because we seem to have gone from a refusal rate of 2.38%, then up to 8%, and then up to 22.2% in this last year. I know that the planning element is not necessarily yours, but is that the extrapolation that we can make, that inappropriate development applications are coming forward?
Yes, I think that's a fair assumption in that inappropriate in some respects or difficult to be made where the circumstances of the policies aren't quite lined up in the way that they could be. So that refusal rate probably does reflect that. Because it looks back at last year. It's in recognition of the fact that the local plan is still awaiting, or certainly was last year. The circumstances that have changed notably this year, was still in a degree of uncertainty to which the weight that could be applied to some of those emerging policies was somewhat more limited, and therefore without knowing exactly the details of these applications, but presumably where they may look or may be more favourable in the context of an adopted local plan for reasons around weight that can be applied to those policies, they haven't been able to be approved.
So if we had a plan, if we had a plan adopted, some of the ones that seemingly have been refused may actually have been approved.
Yeah, again, caveat that with
Yes,
not knowing the
we've
details,
not known
but
the
indeed,
details,
certainly that the likelihood, I would say, would rise notably with that, but without knowing the details.
I do wonder on that one as well, Councillor Pavlik. We did always expect when the local plan got nearer to adoption that those individual sites that were not in the local plan were likely to be brought forward speculatively on the grounds that they're not in the local plan. So there's no point waiting, and I may as well chuck them in and see if I can get them through before. So it may be that that's part of that. Was that Councillor Fisher?
But I was just going to make that same point. My last authority previous to this prepared a local plan. As soon as it came close to being inspected or adopted, there was an immediate rash of applications from people whose land wasn't in the neighbourhood plan, in the local plan, to try and preempt the local plan and try and get development, largely on the grounds that the authority didn't have a 5-year land supply. So that's why there were a lot of refusals, and I suspect that's the same here.
But I do think, Chair, that there is something that needs a deeper exploration, because, you know, we've dropped from 46 applications for major grants, major applications in 2020 to 2021, down to 21. I mean, under half, and we refused more. So what is it that, what are the issues? What is it that's going on with developers as to why they're not bringing applications forward, but the ones that they are, seemingly, have got a higher level of refusals?
John's coming out.
Yeah, I think the underlying issue is that you can see with the consents, the authorities probably consented the vast majority of the brownfield sites that are available in the city that will be major applications. So the underlying issue is to adopt the local plan which releases the land for major applications to be successful. And as you've intimated, they would have a higher degree of likelihood of being successful if they're in accordance with the local plan. So the remedy is to get the local plan adopted.
Okay, look, then coming back on Councillor Pavlich's earlier point, I've lost the page now. So looking at about the performance over 3 years of the table, I've now lost on page 40, I believe. Yeah, net housing. No, the housing delivery table. I'm looking at something. Reports to housing delivery. I've written on it now, so I should be able to find it. Because the numbers on that one don't accord. Page 37. The numbers on page 37 don't quite accord with the ones on page 8. So, I mean, it does show in answer to Councillor Pavlich's question that the worst period was 2011 to 2015, if you're taking a 3-year point, but those figures of 449, 560, 622 on page 8, those are 451, 627, 704. So it's why the discrepancy, and also what discrepancy will that have on the 402 figure?
Can I just ask a point of clarity?
Yeah.
Have those measures been consistent in terms of what we've counted within the housing delivery period? Because I don't believe we used to count student housing within that figure.
I don't know where we always have.
I think that changed in about 2017.
Yes, so the figures in Annex B, the table on net completions, doesn't include the student housing contributions, which do feed into the housing delivery test results, because they're a requirement of the housing flow reconciliation reporting that the council provides annually to the government.
So if I may, approximately what proportion of the more recent approvals is student housing versus other forms of residential? Because if we're going to make a comparison, we should compare like for like.
So looking very briefly at the past 5 years, it's worth just noting that the way that the student housing feeds into the differentiation between net completions or kind of conventional housing completions and net communal establishment completions is slightly more complex. It doesn't evenly spread them out because there's a kind of a bespoke approach that is applied. But it's a very varied picture, I would say. So in some years, we've got almost 50% of communal establishments feeding into that figure, whereas it drops notably to like less than a couple of percentage points in earlier years of the plan period. So there isn't a consistent figure that applies across all of that, I would say.
So I think what would perhaps be helpful, obviously, I appreciate you can't do it for this meeting, but just for going forward, because I think that, you know, we all around the table are, you know, we're all keen to see as many houses delivered as we can and all of that sort of thing. But, you know, there is obviously a difference. I understand that we are, you know, we count dwellings of all types, but I think certainly for residents, you know, they wouldn't necessarily see student dwellings as being directly supporting the housing delivery that they might need, although, you know, we can argue the toss about to what extent it frees up other forms of accommodation or not. But I think to be able to kind of understand the picture, it might be useful at a future meeting just to have a separated out figure, so we actually can see a consistent across, you know, if we're going to look at the last 10 years, know that actually we're looking at the same data across that 10-year period, or how the breakdown of those figures is changed by, you know, a couple of significant student developments in one planning year will presumably bump a figure up quite considerably, and then if there's none the following year, it will drop back down again quite considerably.
Neil, you?
Yeah, and so just to say, I entirely agree with Councillor Crawshaw in terms of the separation. It gives you a better understanding of the nature of development coming forward. But clearly, we reflect in the formulaic approach within this that is asked of us by government in terms of delivery of housing. I think it just to go back to my previous comment in terms of the brownfield site major applications coming forward in the city, having consumed the majority of those sites that are able to be developed in the city, the most profitable form of development in recent years on those brownfield sites that have got intrinsically high costs has been student and flatted accommodation. The local plan will deliver the homes that I know you all want. Is effectively that provides the space within the planning framework for the delivery of those applications that will come forward with what we would all class as domestic, regular domestic accommodation rather than city accommodation.
Did you have more questions, Councillor Pavlovic? Well, nobody else is waving at me enthusiastically, so I shall hand the floor to you.
Sorry, Laura. Right, so if we now start to move to the key issues and barriers moving forward, and these are, I think, given the current state of the economy and moving forward as far as once the plan's adopted, what are we actually going to see. But just to talk about on page 28, you talk about lack of clarity in planning definitions. In respect of independent living and extra care properties, and whether they are C2 or C3, whether they're classed, and that is relevant for affordable housing provision. What impact is the fact that developers are arguing with the local planning authority? How much is that slowing the whole process down, and what do we need to be able to break that logjam?
Yes, it's I don't think we have I'll be corrected and I can check the figures. I don't think we have a huge number of these applications. Certainly had some,
Recently.
Yes, yeah. No, I'm aware of recent ones, but in terms of them forming a kind of significant proportion of applications, I don't think they are, but it doesn't take away from the fact that it is a challenge, and it does cause protracted application process. it's a difficult one because as a professional planner would say, it's often a matter of fact and degree, which depends on the materials and nature of the application that's coming forward, to the extent that it falls in one category or another. The local plan has tried to respond to the issue, recognising that it is something that crops up, and policy is directed in there to try and provide that further clarification insofar as it can do so within the technicalities of the legislation and how it describes the particular use classes. So the local plan is doing what it can to navigate that, and hopefully once that policy starts to be used and applied, it will provide some assistance for speeding up those more difficult applications.
Yeah, that's helpful, because I think that amongst other things, it is going to be one of the problems that we're going to find moving forward, that schemes are going to get stalled and it's going to take longer and longer. And certainly when I'm talking to developers, one of the issues that they're saying is the length of time from, if you like, pre-app to application coming in front of committee. I know a lot of things are in legislation, but from a local authority perspective, is what can we as an authority to do to say, right, we've got these schemes coming forward, they're in the local plan, let's get them in front of a committee, let's get them potentially approved, and let's start getting some shovels in the ground.
Yeah, understood, and accept that is a challenge. And I think one of the things that we are hoping to do, which will help to provide clarity around the policy position, is the supplementary planning documents. The affordable housing one will certainly touch on some of these issues, and matters such as tenure type and the mix of housing that often can cause a lot of conversation and negotiation at those earlier stages, which again can delay timescales, will hopefully be speeded up by more clarity provided through this supplementary planning document, that will in effect give developers more of a kind of clear, won't quite be a checklist, but it will certainly provide a very strong identification of where they need to go with their applications to avoid getting into long and lengthy negotiation positions.
So you're prepping the SPD, your team will be prepping the SPDs. Now we've got an adoption, fingers crossed, adoption date of September. You're talking about the SPDs being prepared and completed for the following year. I appreciate that there may be slippage involved in that as well. Would it not make sense to have the two things, particularly the affordable housing SPD, completed almost at the same time, so that clarity for developers is there right from the outset? The minute that the plan is adopted, they know exactly what they're working to.
Yes, what we've done is really tried to make sure that we are jumping on the back of the adoption process. But what we have to be able to do is the supplementary planning documents can only be adopted once the local plan's in place. And the process for getting to an adoption of a supplementary planning document requires us to go through a certain level of stages and milestones, including consultation. So if we work back from that adoption process that's forecast early next year, certainly the back end of next year, then it will be available for public consultation at around the point at which the plan is adopted. So the approach that the authority is seeking to take on these matters will be publicly acknowledged soon as, or hopefully very soon after adoption, so that those issues are made public.
Got Neil wanted to come in at the moment.
Yeah, just to say, we can't entirely agree, and that's what we've tried to do. I think it makes sure that there is adopted as quickly thereafter that the policies are confirmed, because the SPDs have got to reflect the policy. So once you know what the policy is, then you can consult on the clarity in the SPD, then you adopt the SPD, and members of directed officers to concentrate on housing and climate change to get that accelerated delivery. In respect to the commentary about developers, I think, and this is something that already Becky's team is the DM who will be managing these applications as they come in, looking at the how well the service is prepared to deal with the new environment, where we do have clarity of policy provided by members' decisions on what is the local plan policies and inspected, and that will lead to a lot. The anticipation is that it will lead to a lot shorter period in terms of applications coming in and decisions. We may see a drop in the number of applications that are approved, because we've got a very high approval rate at the moment, because we spend an awful lot of time discussing and negotiating and going backwards and forwards with developers, which leads to high levels of adoption, but long periods of time. And in part of that is due to the fact that there aren't the clarity within the policy framework, because York doesn't have a local plan. So there's some opportunity for discussion and debate with developers, which extends the time frame. So I think for members and officers, having a strong policy framework, then supplemented with sort of more detailed and supplementary planning documents, will mean accelerated decision making, but it may lead to a drop in approvals. Because effectively you will one expects you will want to adhere to your policies and not accept policy applications that aren't forthcoming in accordance with your expectations. So that's the broad expectation going forward.
And whilst I agree with you to the extent that that is the ideal, the obvious barrier to that happening is whether there is sufficient resourcing post adoption, because where we're at the moment, you could argue that staffing levels are appropriate. I wouldn't, but you can. One could. However, once the plan's adopted, we should see a shift in the number of applications coming through. The major applications that are going to need planning officer time, and I suppose this is more of an editorial question than in respect to this report. But have we got the infrastructure internally in place to be able to process that?
Yeah. So we are gearing up for that, and the expectation, because as I've alluded to, the expectation is we would expect major applications to come forward. Those major applications, and we're engaging already with some of the major sites, not wanting to preempt, but just working on the basis that the timetable that we've scheduled out today is going to be achieved, that they will have applications in place, and discussing with those major developers about the resourcing that they and we will fund to effectively deliver those applications early, because you're looking at some very large applications that will deliver significant numbers, rather than what we have at the moment is what particularly we had through the COVID period, a huge number of relatively small applications, small fees, which led to a position where you've got an awful lot of applications, not a lot of revenue coming in.
No.
And I wouldn't do any of my service justice if I wasn't to say to members, and I'm sure you would expect me to say this, that if we had more resources, we could do more. But clearly, we have to, as senior officers, reflect the difficult decisions you have to make as to where your priorities are. Is that an extra planning officer, or is that a local development officer?
Sure.
I don't recall a point in the all the time I've been a councillor, we've had enough resource in any department. So probably, you know,
I totally get that. But if you recall the local plan hearings, and I suppose I'll better look to Laura now, when you looked at what the developers were saying from their timelines as to when they're going to build out, yes, whilst it will take a long period to build a whole site out, the applications were really front loaded, weren't they, in the immediate post-plan period. And so that's why I'm concerned that we're going to, in these next couple of years really, we're going to see applications go like that, and we haven't got the staff to be able to process them. And you need specialist and qualified staff to be able to look at these large applications. So it's a question.
I had Councillor Orwell with a supplementary about 20 minutes ago, so I'm not sure which point of the conversation it was supplementary to. And then I've got Councillor Holly.
You were at the point, just a couple of points. the role of government and the role of developers. Because we've had an application which was passed in January and a public following public inquiry, and we still haven't got a decision on it from government. The second thing is developers. It doesn't matter how many we pass, if developers won't develop, we can't build them. And if there's a recession, they'll stop building, or they'll stop building halfway through a development and leave the site and don't come back for several years sometimes. So there needs to be some sort of national change in policy in terms of developers developing sites that have been passed.
And they will also manage supply to maximise profit as well, which is something else that they will do in terms of that. So they probably won't deliver the $5,000 once because it will devalue the ones that are building. But Councillor Hollier.
Thanks, Chair. One of the very few sort of good things that might be coming out of the government's changes to the planning system is giving councils more, I guess, flexibility for fees and charges. Have we, we taking that into account in this process? Is there any idea of how that might help?
Well, the next meeting of the local plan working group will consider one of those fees, which will be the SIL fee, and I'll pass to Laura as to the current thinking on national policy on fees going forward. But
much like everything else that's discussed on planning reform at the moment, it is somewhat up in the air, I think it's fair to say. There's been lots talked about it, lots in the media very recently on proposals for that, proposals for the infrastructure levy, which would replace the community infrastructure levy, all of which is really held up with the LURB at the moment, and the reporting on that has just been delayed. So we are eagerly awaiting announcements on that. I wouldn't take I personally wouldn't be taking confidence in what's been said at the moment as being what will happen, because I think we've seen very recently as things have been said at government level and then haven't come to fruition. So I treat it with caution. We may well see it, but at the moment I wouldn't put significant amounts of money on it.
That's going to fix our budget problems with whatever you told us to put our money on there, Laura. Councillor Pavlovich, any?
Oh, I think you've probably heard enough from me, haven't you?
I can come back to you anytime. I can never hear enough from Councillor Pavlovich. Councillor Melly.
Thank you, Chair. I was a last minute substitution to this committee, so I need to confess I haven't thoroughly read all the papers. But from what I have read, is there anything in there about housing co-ops and community-owned housing? Because we've just been talking a lot about profit and profit motives and how that can slow down development. Is there any support for non-profit housing development, cooperatives and community housing, that sort of thing?
The self-build agenda, which the community housing is largely linked to as well, is recognised in the action plan as something that the council is actively working towards, and I can't find specifically the paragraph number.
It's number 15 in the action plan.
Yeah,
but that's usually smaller plots, isn't it? Individual dwellings or 2 or 3 dwellings at a time.
That, yes,
maybe as part of larger developments.
Yes, yeah, no, that's quite right. Broadening it out hasn't been specifically included as an action, but it's certainly something that we could feed into it, recognising the points you raised of its importance and general support alongside other forms of housing delivery.
But Neil, I think, wants to come in on that.
Thank you. Very good point. I mean, just to reflect, last year's delivery was significantly supported by the council's own not-for-profit housing delivery programme in terms of the number of deliveries. And in respect of going forward, just to reflect on the local plans policy on affordable housing, you're looking into total quantum around about 4,000 homes that are in that affordable category, and we would expect the registered providers, ourselves and others, to be involved with developers in the delivery of those 4,000 affordable homes that we effectively are built into the plan over the plan period.
Any further questions? Okay, Councillor Crawshaw.
Thanks, Chair. Just a quick one, really, hopefully. Page 21, Annex A, paragraph 4.8, which is just acknowledging that York has a shared housing market area with Selby, but making clear that there's no requirement on York to meet the unmet provision. Is there any risk? Because obviously we're moving towards a combined authority and the mayor has some compulsory purchase and development powers and that sort of thing. Is there any risk to that we foresee at the moment going forwards?
Not at this point in time. There's no intention at this time for the mayoralty, the combined authority, to have planning powers. Clearly, as the new combined authority starts to look at consolidating all of the local plans for the respective districts, then significant consultation with York will be needed. And I think the governance arrangements for the new combined authority, I think, will assist in that conversation significantly, because whilst a relatively small proportion of the land take, we're going to have equality on that combined authority in terms of influence of decision making, and that will be, I think, a risk for future members to definitely consider.
I think Selby have recently identified land for about 500,000 houses, haven't they, in that particular area, to all the 10 Fulford school. Any further questions or comments? Councillor Polovic.
Couldn't resist, sorry. On 620, you talk about currently developers of student flats and office to residential do not pay housing commuted sum, affordable housing commuted sums. That's now been incorporated as a major modification into the plan that's going out for consultation. By the way, thanks to the Labour group. But what I wanted to ask you was, what consequence do you think, if that is approved and if that does become part of an adopted plan, will it slow down the amount of student accommodation that's being built and then potentially open those up for residential development? Or will it just be, we'll see the same amount, but we'll get the commuted sums for affordable housing? Have you got any sort of sense as to what the consequences of it might be?
Until it's tested, then not specifically. I think that my gut feeling would be that it probably won't drastically reduce the amount of student accommodation, as that policy, that specific policy itself on the affordable housing contribution. What may additionally start to see a more rebalancing of those sites, and sites that might then otherwise come forward for other housing, will be the nomination agreement, which was also a requirement or added in as a requirement of the policy. So the two policy levers together might start to work to shift that balance. But it's worth saying that the viability testing that was undertaken to support the amount of affordable housing that was going to be generated from student housing was very carefully looked at and considered, so that it didn't make schemes unviable. Because we couldn't do that, because then it wouldn't be accepted as a modification through the local plan. It has to be viable. So in pure viability terms, it shouldn't make a difference. But it's the reason I say that the nomination agreement requirement might be the one that starts to change things.
And I suppose that viability question comes to the crux of pretty much everything, because if developers are paying over the odds for the land, then that impacts on affordable housing, it impacts on viability for a whole heap of things, as we've seen. And you mention it in 6.18, land bought by developers when land values were at their peak over 10 years ago has resulted in a small but significant number of sites that have just not been developed, and we've seen that even in the city centre. How are we going to cut across that? I mean, I know that there isn't currently a use it or lose it bit in legislation, but is there any even potential for CPO, compulsory purchase, to buy the sites so that they actually do get developed out?
I think Neil wants to come in on this one.
So just on viability, I think the local plan working group will have a much broader discussion about that in January, because the SIL report is coming in January, and the fundamental basis of the SIL report, we start to look at the categories of housing across the city, look at the viability appraisal in respect of all the policies that are required of the local plan, and then say, is there any more headroom for a SIL levy to be put on top of that? And then that has to be proportionate, as Laura said, not to discourage development, but reflect, I think, the statement that you made at the head of the meeting in terms of making sure that there isn't that, or that Mr. Beacon made at the head of the meeting, make sure that there isn't just that sort of windfall gain that from land ownership. So that's the first point about viability. I think the second point in respect of CPO, we don't, as an authority, have the power to intervene just on the basis of, should we say, the niceties of cash flow or bringing forward development early. Clearly, if there's social outcomes or a broader regeneration outcome, then we can have those discussions. So, for example, the last one that we sort of successfully expedited as an authority was working with Homes England, the Unipart site, where we were having discussions with them about, well, if we were to CPO this land, what's the valuation? And we came to an agreement without having to go down the legal route. But for major sites where there is a broader community need, then we can look at specific sites. But for broader intervention, just to purchase a site because effectively a landowner is overpaid for it, unless it's in that, like I say, that position of unlocking a broader social good, then we don't generally have a CPO power for that situation.
Councillor Crawshaw.
Thanks, Chair. I'm not sure whether this should be reflected in an action plan on housing delivery or not, but I was just sort of thinking that, you know, one of the biggest pressures on housing in my ward at the moment is Airbnb or, you know, short-term holiday let, and the number of properties that are being bought up for investment purposes. And we've had a couple of developments in the ward where actually the developer has chosen themselves to sort of allocate one block for Airbnb or allowing Airbnb, and then saying that they'll put a you know, something within the deeds or the lease of the properties that the other parts of the block can't be used for that. And it does seem to me that, you know, again, we can argue the toss over whether or not the target number in the housing delivery is high enough or otherwise. But just in the last year or two, I would suggest that some of the pressures on housing delivery have changed because of that. And I'm just wondering whether there's anything that could go into this kind of a action plan, or whether it would need to go through an SPD or through some other sort of planning process, whereby I know there's been some applications where we've sought to condition a minimum rental period, for example, to try to just disrupt that very short-term letting. But actually, there may also be some developments where it would be great if that was holiday letting, because that would free up the other stock in the same way that we might make that argument around student letting, you know, student flats freeing up housing stock. And I think if we're thinking about the different pressures that there are currently on the housing market in the city, certainly in the city centre wards, that buying to invest for short-term holiday letting is a major pressure, which must necessarily impact in this. So it's a kind of slightly tangential, but I'm just wondering if there's something within our housing delivery, because it does matter what type of housing we're delivering, as well as just a net number over the top.
Well, not actual interest, but I think it's not just a city centre issue as well. As a neighbour of an Airbnb, actually, some of those in areas with elderly residents, where those residents are unfortunately passing on, it then becomes an easier option to say, well, actually, I've got my property, I can keep that in Airbnb rather than having to try and sell it, etc. So it is a problem all over, especially probably more so in the city centre. But I think, Neil, do you want to come on that?
Yeah, so first of all, I've got a declaration of interest on holiday let, and that's on my the register of interest. So just so clarity within the room, but I do reflect, Councillor Crawshaw, there is the full council motion. So the full council motion may be something that you as a committee you could recommend to add to the action plan, because effectively that does, you've already resolved it, that we've had consulted legal colleagues on that, and effectively that is to gather information so that when And if the legislation allows you to produce an SPD, then we would do so. So I think that you've already got on the books, as it were, a decision of full council that you could reflect in the action plan.
There's the conspiracy theories now on the webcast. What did he say? And yeah, I think I was going to suggest that we add that onto the recommendations to exec. Instead of do that one. Any further questions, comments? Sorry, Councillor Fisher.
First of all, can I just absolutely support Councillor Pavlis' suggestion about the need to end land banking, because it's a major problem, and a lot of the consents that we've given are land banks, British Sugar being another example, as far as I'm aware, you know, which we've given the permission, but they're not being built. But let's look at why housing isn't delivered. The first one is shortage of land. Well, the local plan should release some land, which will hopefully lead to more developers coming forward. Developers will only develop if they can make a profit, and to make a profit, they have to have people to buy or rent the accommodation. And I'm afraid, with interest rates having gone up, I suspect that's going to be less people who can afford to buy, or it'll result in a drop in house prices. But the other thing that developers need, I took the liberty of talking to a small to medium builder who doesn't operate particularly in the York area, more in North Yorkshire, about what he requires. And the biggest problem he has, apart from the cost of materials, is skilled people to build the houses. And that's something completely beyond the control of this council. He said that now the availability of skilled workers has become significantly less since Brexit. And I'm sorry if that upsets one member around this table, but Brexit has been a significant problem. And we've got two alternatives. Either the government can incentivise those workers from Eastern Europe to come back into the country and work and give them the visas they need, or it could train our indigenous workforce. What have we seen from central government to deal with this labour shortage of skilled workers? Any question, you know, is a key point.
Clearly, from the authority's own perspective, you've got a skills strategy that you've taken forward, and they've taken that forward with York College and the universities, and that identifies from recollection that, in particular, I know it does, off the top of my head, it does address the issue of the retrofit and the need to enhance the insulation on properties. So building skills is in there. And also with the combined authority, one of the devolution of power that the area will get is the adult education budget. You know, clearly that will allow you to, as an authority, to influence the priorities within that adult education programme across the region.
Councillor Pavlich, you're going to respond to Councillor Fisher's suggesting that you're a rabid Brexiteer.
Yeah, thanks for that, Councillor Fisher. Yes, but just to come back to that point, and Laura's made reference to it actually, which almost seems counterintuitive, that those where there's a higher percentage of affordable housing on them are actually built out at twice the rate of those where there are lower percentages, and you'd think, oh, higher than 30% even, which is a suggestion that's also gone forward, I believe, in the modifications. Why is that?
Why do the affordable housing units deliver quicker?
Yeah, well, why is it that if there's a site that's got 30% or more affordable housing, why are they built out at twice the rate? Is it because they've got to get the profit back?
Well, yes. So usually the affordable housing will form part of the earlier phases because it's not subject to market interest and purchasing in quite the same way. So it's a quick win from a developer's point of view, and it gets cash back into the reserve, which can be reinvested in the rest of the site. So that really does help to speed things along.
I think it goes back to Councillor Fisher's point. It's not just about developers making profit, it's about developers making as much profit as they possibly can. And if they think holding on to the private sales for a little bit longer, when mortgage interest rates have decreased and more mortgage availability will mean they can sell those for more, they hang on to those a bit longer, whereas the social housing of generally a fixed price and they sell those on quite quickly.
But it's also a reason why I think we should be robust in ensuring that we get the maximum amount of affordable housing on sites, and challenging viability assessments to reduce that percentage whenever we can and as robustly as we can.
On that last point, that's absolutely the point of the viability appraisals out of the local plan. And again, you'll see at the next meeting that the headroom and where we can go with SIL on top of that. And I think particularly the affordable homes associated with the student accommodation was a big missing tool in the box, which has now been well corrected in terms of the amendment to the local plan. I think the other piece in terms of, and the members have made the point in terms of those sales, it's just worth reflecting that those houses, when they're built for affordable, is from the developer's perspective, are heavily discounted to market. So effectively they represent a guaranteed sale, but at a significantly lower price. But what it does do is cash flow a development. And because we as an authority from a planning policy perspective often require through the conditions significant amounts of infrastructure to be built out, then actually that early sale of affordable housing provides cash flow to deliver the infrastructure. So it's quite an interesting and complex balance between your requirements in terms of infrastructure, your requirements in terms of affordable housing, and the overall cash profile of a development. But as I think other members have highlighted, what you tend to look for, or what you see within the profile of a developer's scheme budget, is that there's what they would characterize as a balloon payment at the end. All the cash and the profit starts to fall out at the end of the scheme. So the early piece is all about cash flowing and getting infrastructure and policy compliance. The back end is where they make all the profit.
I'm noticing a distinct difference of opinion between those of us who are here for planning at 4:30 and those of you who have come in for lunch and want to get off quite quickly. Not only that, has anybody got any other questions or anything that they wanted to raise with officers at this point? Obviously, this goes on to executive, so there will be opportunity if anybody wants to raise anything in the interim. If not, my suggestion then is we have the recommendation on page 6, paragraph 8, which will be amended slightly. If committee is happy to defer to Neil, Callum and myself a form of wording for what that recommendation is regarding the full council motion to be added into the action plan, rather than try and write it by committee at this moment in time. Everybody happy with those recommendations? Yes, Councillor Murray.
Can I haven't thought of any exact wording, sorry, but something about housing co-ops being seen as like developers and supported to bring forward developments, rather than only being seen as maybe picking up small sites as part of larger developers if a for-profit developer brings a site forward.
So this goes to...
There are a couple of housing co-ops in the city and who haven't been able to bring forward their larger sites for various reasons, and I haven't seen anything in here about supporting them.
Shall we take that as an additional recommendation for you to send something to Neil, which he can include as an addendum to the report and it goes to exec, and we can consider it exec at that point? Yeah. Rather than trying to work out what it is, now it just gives you the time, but then if we get something between now and exec on the 16th of December, is it? 15th. Yeah. Just give us the opportunity to form that up and then see what it is that we can do. Okay, with those 2 slight amendments, are we happy with those recommendations? Yeah. Okay. I have no urgent business, so I'm happy to declare the meeting closed. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.